Today I want to examine the issue that may influence your everyday life more than any military move, any diplomatic statement, or any stock market jump in the weeks ahead. And what I am about to explain could reshape how you think about national power and the grocery aisle you visit each week for years to come. Everyone is watching the fighting. Everyone is watching fuel prices. Everyone is watching the Strait of Hormuz. But almost nobody is paying attention to the factor that will decide which nations survive this crisis and which nations eventually fail. Food. Not oil, not technology, not military force. Food. Because the nations that control food production, food exports, and the inputs that make food possible are likely to become the most influential nations on Earth right now. And the nations that rely on importing their food will discover just how fragile their entire existence really is in moments like this. Let me walk you through this carefully because this is the economic story nobody is telling you right now. So let's begin with the basics today. What is food power? Think about what food really means in economic terms. Every human being on Earth needs to eat every day, no exceptions. That is not optional. You can survive without a new phone, you can survive without a holiday, you can survive without a new car, but you cannot survive without food. And that makes food the ultimate strategic resource. More powerful than oil, more powerful than chips, more powerful than nuclear weapons. Because you can choose not to drive, you cannot choose not to eat. And here is the key insight most people completely miss today. Modern food production does not work without three things: energy to run the tractors, the trucks, the refrigeration, and the supply chain; fertilizer to make the soil productive enough to feed 8 billion people; and water, obviously, to grow anything at all. This conflict is disrupting all three simultaneously, and that is why food is about to become the most important geopolitical tool on Earth. Let me show you the figures. Up to 30% of globally traded fertilizer passed through the Strait of Hormuz before this conflict began. The Gulf states were the largest regional exporter of urea and ammonia, both nitrogen-based fertilizers worldwide. Since the strait closed on February 28th, urea prices have surged nearly 46% in a single month. The World Bank confirmed this. A 46% jump in the most critical farming input on Earth in 30 days. Now think about what that means in practice for farmers. The USDA projects food prices in America will rise 3.1% in 2026. That estimate was made before the full effect of this conflict hit. The real number will almost certainly be higher. Beef and dairy prices are already 12.1% higher than a year ago. KuBank, one of the country's largest agricultural lenders, says fuel and fertilizer prices have risen 20 to 40% since the conflict began, warning that higher diesel costs alone could add thousands of dollars per farmer in many cases. And a professor of food economics at Michigan State University said it very simply: tractors run on diesel. Most food moved across America travels by truck every day. Higher fuel costs turn into higher costs across the supply chain, and eventually that reaches you at the supermarket checkout. If you are watching from Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, or Ohio, you already know this very well. Farmers across the Midwest are watching input costs explode while crop prices stay depressed because of the ongoing trade dispute with China. Josh Boxall, who grows corn and soybeans 50 miles north of Indianapolis, said plainly, "The farmer is not seeing higher prices for the goods we sell, but everyone is seeing the increase at the grocery store." A seventh-generation Illinois farmer named John Yale said he has had to cope with rising costs for fertilizer, equipment, and healthcare all at once today. And the president of the Iowa Farmers Union, Aaron Lehman, described how federal assistance checks arrived on February 28th, the same day the conflict began. His words were, "The joke was that the check barely hit the farm before it went out the door to the fertilizer dealer." This is not abstract economics. This is happening right now in the heartland too. And it is about to get worse because reducing this nitrogen fertilizer application by just 10 to 15% or delaying application by 2 to 4 weeks can reduce corn yields by 10 to 25%. Less corn means less feed for livestock. Less feed means more expensive beef, pork, and poultry. More expensive meat means more expensive everything at your local Walmart, Kroger, or Costco nearby. The food supply chain is a row of dominoes, and the first one has already fallen. Subscribe for more analysis of how this conflict is reshaping the global economy, explained in simple English. Because understanding what is happening to food right now means understanding what is happening to your future. Now let me zoom out, because America's situation, while serious, is actually the best case scenario worldwide. And the reason is simple. America has something that most nations on Earth do not possess: land. Vast, fertile, productive agricultural land. America's food and agriculture industry contributes $10.4 trillion in annual economic value to the U.S. economy. That is nearly 20% of the entire national economy. It supports nearly 49 million American jobs. U.S. agricultural exports are projected at $174 billion in 2026. America produces corn, soybeans, wheat, beef, dairy, poultry, fruits, and vegetables at a scale very few nations can match today. The Western Hemisphere, America, Canada, Brazil, and Argentina, is Earth's most food-rich region today. And this is where the real geopolitical shift is happening. Because in a world where food becomes scarce and expensive, the nations that produce food become extraordinarily powerful. And America is the most powerful food-producing nation on Earth today. That is not an opinion, that is arithmetic. The American Farm Bureau, the USDA, and Texas A&M University all confirm the same structural reality. America can feed itself. Most of the world cannot. Now let us look at who cannot feed themselves. And this is where the story turns very dark. Let us start with the Gulf states. The GCC, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain. These nations are built in a desert. Almost no agricultural land, almost no fresh water, almost no capacity to grow food at any meaningful scale. Every piece of food consumed in Dubai, Riyadh, or Doha is imported. The GCC imports over $3 billion in U.S. agricultural exports alone every single year. And those imports depend on functioning supply chains, stable shipping routes, and enough money to keep buying. This conflict is disrupting all three. The GCC built its wealth on oil, and it spent that wealth creating the appearance of modern nations. Cool cities in the desert, desalination plants turning seawater into drinking water, and millions of imported workers. But none of that produces a single calorie of food. And when the mirage of stability that the GCC built over decades fades, as it is fading right now, the food dependency becomes existential. Now let us talk about Africa, because Africa is where the food crisis becomes a humanitarian catastrophe. The World Food Programme reports that 318 million people across 68 countries are now facing crisis-level hunger. That number has more than doubled since 2019. The WFP projects that an additional 45 million people could fall into hunger if this conflict continues past mid-year. That would bring the global total to 363 million, the worst hunger crisis on record. And here's the mechanism that connects the conflict to the hunger. Africa imports the vast majority of its fertilizer. When urea prices surge 46% in a single month, African farmers cannot afford to fertilize their fields. The Food and Agriculture Organization warns that even a 10% reduction in fertilizer availability could reduce maize, rice, and wheat production in sub-Saharan Africa by up to 25%. In Kenya, farmers in the North Rift food basket regions have been lining up as early as 2 a.m. to access fertilizer, with rationing limiting available supplies. In Nigeria, 27.2 million people are already facing crisis-level hunger. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, 26.7 million. In Sudan, in the middle of a civil war and confirmed famine, 19.1 million. And the worst part is this. The fertilizer shock that happened in March has not yet reached harvest data or grocery shelves. The real impact will hit food markets in the third and fourth quarter of 2026. This is a slow-motion catastrophe. The seed has been planted, if you'll forgive the expression, and the harvest of hunger is coming soon. Every major food price shock in modern history has produced political consequences that financial markets failed to predict accurately. In 2008, rising food prices triggered riots in 48 countries. In 2010 and 2011, a 40% spike in food prices helped topple 4 governments across the Middle East and North Africa. The Arab Spring was not mainly about democracy, it was about bread. And the 2026 crisis is unfolding at a larger scale across more countries with fewer resources to contain it than anything we have seen before in modern history. Now let us talk about China, because China reveals another side of food power that most people do not understand. China maintains massive grain reserves. It stockpiles more than half of global wheat and corn storage. Think about that number. One country holding more than half of the world's stored wheat and corn. This is not accidental. This is strategy. Beijing understands something most Western governments have forgotten already. The nation that controls food reserves controls its own destiny. But China has a problem. Its domestic consumption is weak. Chinese families are saving instead of spending because they see uncertainty ahead everywhere. Chinese household savings remain stubbornly high, and China's agricultural model depends on enormous energy inputs. The same energy that is now becoming scarce and expensive because of the Hormuz closure. China imports approximately 40% of its energy from the Gulf. That energy powers the tractors, the irrigation systems, the food processing plants, and cold chain logistics that move food from farm to table across a nation of 1.4 billion people. If that energy becomes too expensive, food production costs rise, food prices rise, and the social contract between the Chinese government and its people, the implicit promise of economic stability in exchange for political compliance, comes under severe strain. Now, let me show you the historical pattern because we have seen this before, and the pattern is terrifying. In the 1930s, when global trade collapsed during the Great Depression, nations that could not feed themselves had to go out and take food from others. Japan expanded into China and Southeast Asia. Germany expanded into Eastern Europe. The scramble for resources was not mainly about ideology, it was about survival. Nations that could not feed their populations faced revolution at home or expansion abroad. Those were the only two options, and they chose expansion. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union could not feed itself. It was forced to buy grain from the United States, its ideological rival. That food dependency gave Washington leverage over Moscow. Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz understood this when he said, "Food is a weapon." Henry Kissinger understood it when he reportedly said, "Control oil and you control nations. Control food and you control people." In 2010, Russia experienced a devastating drought that destroyed its wheat crop. Moscow imposed an export ban to protect its domestic supply. That single decision removed millions of tons of wheat from the global market, pushed prices across the Middle East and North Africa, and within months, governments were falling. The Arab Spring was ignited by bread prices in Tunisia. And now, in 2026, we are watching the same pattern repeat at a scale that dwarfs everything that came before in modern history. The Strait of Hormuz closure has simultaneously disrupted energy, fertilizer, and food supply chains. Over 30% of globally traded fertilizer normally transits through that strait. 20% of the world's oil, 20% of the world's LNG. When all three are disrupted simultaneously, the impact on global food production is not additive. It is multiplicative. Because energy affects fertilizer production, fertilizer affects crop yields affect livestock feed affects meat prices, and meat prices affect every single grocery bill in America and around the world. Let me bring this together with where the power is shifting. The nations that will emerge from this crisis with the most geopolitical power are not the ones with the largest armies or the most advanced technology. They are the ones that can feed themselves and others. America, with its vast agricultural capacity across the Midwest and Great Plains, its freshwater resources, its advanced farming technology, and its control of major grain exports, is positioned to become even more powerful through food than it has been through military force. Brazil, which has undergone an extraordinary agricultural transformation over the past 40 years, is now a dominant force in soybeans, sugar, coffee, and beef. Russia, despite all its other problems, has become the world's largest wheat exporter, shipping roughly a fifth of global exports. Russia took that title in 2017 and has held it almost every year since. That is not military power, that is food power, and it gives Moscow leverage that no amount of sanctions can fully erase. The losers are the nations that import everything. The GCC, which imports virtually all its food. Southeast Asia, where fertilizer plants are shutting down and farmers cannot afford inputs. Large parts of Africa, where 70% of food is produced by smallholder farmers who have no buffer against price shocks. And Europe, which depends on imported energy to power its food production and imported fertilizer to maintain its yields. Germany's BASF, one of the largest chemical companies in the world, has already raised prices on products from animal feed to household chemicals by more than 30%. The question is not whether food will become the defining strategic resource of this era. It already has. The question is whether the nations that have food power will use it wisely, or whether the scramble for food will follow the same dark pattern it has followed in every previous era of scarcity. Because history is very clear on this point. When people cannot eat, everything else becomes irrelevant. Ideology, diplomacy, alliances, treaties, everything else evaporates when hunger arrives. Truly, the world you grew up in, the world of cheap food shipped globally, available everywhere, affordable to almost everyone in the developed world, That world is ending. Not overnight, but it is ending. And the nations and the people who understand this, who invest in food production, who secure their supply chains, who reduce their dependence on imported inputs, those nations and those people will be in a much stronger position than those who keep walking into the grocery store, assuming the shelves will always be full. Subscribe for more analysis of this conflict and its global economic consequences, explained in simple English. And tell me in the comments, how are food prices changing where you live? And which country do you think has the strongest food position going forward?